last two labs, I had you look at surveys, and then I had you do the interview. Just does anybody see any difference between the way the questions get formed, what you're doing, what you're thinking, doing a survey versus doing an interview? Yes, no, no. Okay. So here's the big difference you get. The interview, all of your questions, you've got flexibility. If you did that 15-minute interview, then all of what you're able to do with that is if they go off on a sidetrack, you can go with them. You have an ability to adapt to what goes on in the room with the other person, as opposed to in a survey, there's no room to adapt. So surveys tend to go with they do go with a quantitative process. Interviewing is a qualitative process. So the survey, you get lots of data from lots of sources. All of the work in a survey, and this is the important part to remember, I think, in comparing the two. In the survey, the important part is all of your work is done ahead of time. You've got to think about what questions to ask. You ask them, you got to think of what the possible answers are. And then as you do them, if there's room for error, if you make an error in a survey process, if you make an error on question 4 of 20, you might have thrown out all of the data from after that might have become useless. If you erred in a survey and the way you set it up, which goes back to the sampling, I talked about it a couple of weeks ago. If you erred when it came to developing your questions you got, the questions you would have got, the demographic questions, what's your gender, what's your age, what's your, did anybody get asked questions, what's your ethnicity? No. All right. Well, so if they asked you ethnicity or color, which I find interesting, if they're trying to capture bias, to ask your ethnicity. So think about in the GTA, think about even in school or friends you've known or going to school. How many people their parents come from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different cultures, perhaps different skin complexions? To ask what's your ethnicity in a survey, I think can leave out a big chunk of who you are. If we're asking a social survey about riding transit, I don't know what your ethnicity necessarily tells me anything. If I ask what your color is, it does. If I ask about the complexion of your skin and are you treated well by drivers or by other passengers, and there's something about the social context of what goes on in a public forum, in a public setting, in a transit system, I need to know how people see you, and it's how they visually see you. Now, I might ask about culture, and then I might ask about attire. If I wanted to get at, so let's get at potentially issues around bias, social bias around color, or if you want to do Islamophobia around, so a couple of years ago, the issues around hijab in Quebec. So something as simple as, well, it's not as simple as that, it's a big deal, but something like that. If I just simply ask, what they might do is sort of narrow in and say, are you male? Are you female? Are you Muslim? Are you other religion? Are you, do you wear a hijab? Don't you? They could make that fairly straightforward to narrow in on that very narrow space of, if you do you feel that you're mistreated? They could ask is, if you don't, and have you observed where it's happened? And to get an issue of whether it's gender, do women notice it differently than men? If someone got onto a bus wearing a burqa, hijab, and were they treated differently? So it would be a very narrowly focused set of questions. But I think I would also want to ask about complexion of skin, because are you treated differently as a Black woman wearing a hijab versus a more lighter skin, more closer to my color of skin wearing a hijab? Is there a difference? Those sorts of things, that demographic question, if I haven't asked about what's your complexion, I may miss something completely. So it's something that you, when you're doing surveys, it's easy to miss what you're looking for. You've got to get at, and if you've kind of collected all your data and done nothing, you've missed something, you're in trouble. If I didn't ask that question, I could have this great survey that I think is really valuable and really interesting social context, and it might be really useful, it seems, until somebody says to me, well, wait a minute, do women get treated differently depending on the color of their skin or complexion of their skin? And I say that, Matt, so, and now all of your data is garbage. You're probably going to have to toss it out and start again. If it's a PhD, you start at year 1, and unfortunately, this is year 5. So the survey seems like a simple method. We often do that. If you're going to do some little assignment in another course at some point and you have to gather data, they're going to say, oh, do a survey. Think very carefully about the questions you ask in the survey and the options you give them to answer. If we do gender today, and I think I talked about this before in the sampling, if you do gender and you only do male, female, other is such a broad term that might actually feel offensive to people, or maybe potentially not even offensive, just excluded. And if they feel like they're left out, they may not join in your survey. They may not answer for you. So you end up in this spot where you missed it by accident. There's the hard part with surveys. When you go to interview, so all of the hard work in the interview comes in the analysis later. The interview is a long process. You saw, if you've seen the videos, and if not, you will see them this week. When you see the videos, the video on interviewing is a long, slow process. So I think that what you're looking at there is all of the work in the survey is done up front, or the bulk of the work. And the bulk of the work for qualitative interview is done later. It's done after the interview. During the interview and after it's done, it's the analysis part. Qualitative analysis based on surveys. You take your answers, you drop them in categories. SPSS is the program that you'll probably hear about next term. But what you get when you drop that data in is it just flows. They can take it, you can make if then, and it's just a spreadsheet. If category A is this particular course number, then we go to category C. It's if then. If then statements are the independent dependent variable. You just change them in the system. You say which one you want it to be and you let it run. So it will analyze the data for you, those programs. Qualitative doesn't work so easy. With the qualitative interview, you've got to ask your questions a little more focused. Or you don't have to ask them so focused. You can broaden them out. You could ask someone a question depending on the way they responded in the room. It could be physical body language. It could be that they actually say something to you. Could be language. So you could realize that, oh, wait a minute, I'm missing a point. If you asked, so back to the job thing, if I was sitting talking to somebody and interviewing people, and by the time I interview my 4th person about it, I start to realize, oh dear, I missed this issue. I've missed skin complexion. Then I may go back to those people if I can. That can be difficult, but at least there's flexibility going forward to say, wow, I got to do some more interviews. I missed this point. I need to go back and cover it. It's a really big issue. It's not a little one. It's a big deal. I need to go dig in a little deeper. So those things become more flexible. It's more you can adapt more in the interview. So I suggested, I wanted you to write 10 questions ahead of time. So let's look at, let me give us another share. So this really comes out of the video. Can I? Can I get a thumbs up? Have any of you watched the video yet for the class? Or no? You don't, probably wouldn't, because we're in on Monday. So you'll watch them this week, and I'm going to go over these PowerPoints that essentially you're going to have. There's a couple of things you're going to see, and then so next week it'll come back to us. So can you see that screen share? This first set of questions, I run over it in that video class. I run the video lecture with the PowerPoint. I'll run through this set of slides. But essentially what you get in it is these are the things, and it gets dissected better on that video. Here's what you're looking for. I asked you to write 10 questions. This set of slides is a group of slides I've taken from a course from many years ago. Same thing, write 10 questions, ask them about their day yesterday. How does that interview roll? What goes on in it? There's things that come out of this preset questionnaires, the set of 10. And there's different ways to analyze it. You could break it down and do just what are the questions, look at them, what are they asking, how do they go, which is the way a survey is written. What did they write? What possible answers did they give them? Here it's an open-ended question. Well, these are leading questions, but they're open in that the answer is more flexible. So it is an open, although leading, this is an open question. Whenever I do an interview, I try as much as I can to open up my questions. I might lead them somewhere. I might lead the person to say, okay, what happened after lunch? That's the time frame I'm interested in. That's the leading part. But it's an open question about what did you do after lunch, so that way they can fill in, adjust, adapt. And as they talk, I'm going to adjust and adapt. I'm going to ask for more detail. I'm going to dig in a little deeper. So the difference between survey versus the actual qualitative interview. In the survey, I know I'm hoping that some of you, when you did the survey, I just started to look at them, but when you look at the surveys, questions, some of them, the way those questions are asked, they're just flawed. And that's where you've got to stop and think, who wrote the questions? I think a lot of people, I'm not certain on all of it, but I think many of them are PhDs. So just because somebody's got that degree behind their name doesn't necessarily mean they're better at it. It's a skill to be able to broaden your mind, essentially do what I say in a qualitative interview. Open your mind to the possibilities of answers. Not what do I want to find out? What are the possible answers? And somewhere mixed in there is what do I want to find out? And I draw out of it, what do I want to find out? If you do online surveys, psychometric testing, the NEO-PI, NEO-PI is the one I like best. I've used it for years. I've used it in teaching, in training courses, and I've as well done it myself. So it's a psychological assessment tool. It lets you look and say, what's going on? What do you feel? How do you feel about things? It's interesting. It takes a long time to do it. But what you get in those is tucked inside the questions they're looking to test honesty. Are you actually answering your questions honestly? And then they're looking for what indicators are there of being maybe more closed-minded, more open-minded, more gregarious versus more quiet, or shy, more extrovert, introvert. Built into those questions are questions that have answers that identify for the researcher or the psychologist when they do the analysis of it, or yourself if you do your own and do your own analysis of it, because it step by step tells you how to do it. If you do all of those, tucked in those surveys are the possibility of answers. And then whatever you answer they get is what they work with. That's good survey writing. So they actually are not pretty well done. There's one that I've used for, I don't know how many years I've used it, a couple of decades. So that is written in the 50s. It's that good. And it's 20 questions. And in that 20 questions can assess, one is how are you feeling? It's called a health opinion survey. How are you feeling today? So stress levels. So it gives you some indicators of that, but as well in that health opinion survey, it gives you an answer, it gives you a sense of how honest are you being with yourself. In 20, I think it's 21 or 22 questions, we can make an evaluation. I can, or the person can do it themselves. Here's an evaluation of how honest I am with myself about how I'm feeling. And then here's a statement of how I'm feeling. So the honesty level will impact how accurate is the emotional condition I have today. If I've been very honest with myself and my indicators say I'm really stressed or not stressed at all, that's probably pretty good. But if I'm not being so truthful with myself, then I might find that those answers may not be as reliable as I think. I think that on paper I look like I'm all good and smooth, but in fact I'm actually quite upset. Lots going on. I am maybe taxed quite a bit. So the survey question is like what you did. Write down a set of questions. The key in the survey is figuring out what are the possible answers and making sure they're all included. In the qualitative interview, you get your set of 10 questions, which is a nice guide for going in. But when you go in with your nice guide, then you get, what did you watch? So here's one here, right? Here's a nice guide. They went to, what did you do yesterday? There was all the preliminary questions, but this is the key point. What kind of movie did you watch? The Kingdom. Why did you love the movie? They've jumped in and given us some prior information. So I would explore this. I would nullify this interview actually, because the researchers will given a statement that I don't want to have in my data yet. So that set of 10 questions in a qualitative interview, here's the issues I want to get to. Let's just ask the question. Let's just raise the issue, get it on the table, and get the person talking about it. So prior knowledge and assumption, that's a big deal. Interviewers should be careful with that. And then going back and clarifying whatever was undone. So this will all come out of the videos. When you do the video, when you look at the video, I will go over these much more in depth. So, but this, I'm just going to hit the key terms again. Inter-subjectivity. This is what we're after in research. In a qualitative interview, it is two people in the room. It feels like a conversation. So that conversation that it feels like is, just a second, Williams, you're going to see this. This one, I'm just opening up a YouTube video, I'll click you over. So this piece here, this idea of being very social, two people having a conversation, it should feel like a conversation. Although you're collecting data, it's a directed conversation. You try and avoid, you may use leading questions. Leading questions are valuable. They're a valuable tool, but they are
pretty relaxed.
In the value of those tools is if you're going to use a leading question, you need to think about it. You use it for a purpose, a very clear reason. You want to ask the person about what happened at 8 o'clock at night, then you ask them about 8 o'clock. You lead them to the evening. You lead them to 8 o'clock. You only do that. It's a very intentional move. Leading questions should not be just automatic. The trouble with conversation, or not the trouble, the difference in real conversation with people you know, you can ask leading questions. You often do. Your parents probably ask you leading questions. What did you do today? How was your day? How was school? Oh, when you finished a lecture, what was the lecture about? How many times did he curse? So they're going to ask, those are very much leading questions. Those are normal conversations with people you know. In research, you don't know the player, so you don't ask those questions. You might if you need to, but on the face of it, I would say try and avoid asking them whatsoever. This is the key to research, to doing a good interview. It is intersubjective. So I posted this video for you.
conversations. And that's what we're after in an interview. Now, bear in mind, this is an interrogation. Williams knows it's the police, and he knows if he admits what he did, he's going to jail for the rest of his life.
So I have done this clip of the Russell Williams interview. So Russell Williams is a serial predator. He's a, I think there's a series, I think it might be 11. There's a series of sexual assaults, break-ins and sexual assaults, and there's 2 murders he commits. So he's being interviewed by the police. And the reason I do this is, what if you watch this through my analysis. So on the website, you've got the whole interview if you want to watch it. It's about 57 minutes. The interview is actually 4 hours, but they cut it down to 57 minutes. 4 hours of working out a rapport. And that's what I get you looking at on here when in my little analysis on my link is you can see it's not as clear as the regular video because the way I had to do it so I get my words on it. But what you watch is the interviewer in the room. The interviewer set this room up and it just worked out. It's just because of who the guy is. He's a good interview. I met him once. He's got a nice feeling to him. He seems like a nice man. It's kind of that simple. I saw him lecture on what he did and they kept saying you were using this method, this method, this method, like it was all planned out. And he said, no, it wasn't. He was doing very much what a qualitative interviewer does in research. He said, I just kept grasping at straws, trying to find a connection, find something to get him to talk, keep him talking, keep him engaged. That's a conversation. And the reason I use this is because this guy Williams knows that if he speaks, he's going to jail for good. Everything ends if he speaks. And yet, when you watch it, he does. So why? What got him to make himself vulnerable? So here's where, back to the PowerPoints, vulnerability is a key piece for me. An intersubjective conversation, the conversation with the friend you trust them, you tell them things, that's vulnerability. So that vulnerability piece gets you to this idea of what are we doing here? Intersubjectivity. I'm vulnerable, you're vulnerable. If I build a nice, comfortable social space, if you trust me, then you're vulnerable to me because you trust me. That's because I built a social space for that. Or between the two of us in a real life relationship with friends or family, whoever, that would be the two of you build it together. But in an interview process, that's what I'm intentionally trying to build. That place where a person can feel safe to talk. And that's why Williams is of such value. So insider knowledge becomes a big deal in interviewing. And so this comes up, clarifications comes up. So this whole set of slides gets done online on the video. You get more detail on those. The second set okay, just a sec, there it is. The second set of slides is really what the qualitative interview is. So your 10 questions, think about, and maybe talk about it with others. Did you finish all your 10 questions in 15 minutes? That's a pretty fast little questionnaire. That's a survey. You've got your answers and you moved on. Maybe your questions could be changed, maybe not. Maybe you're happy with them. Maybe your questions would, if you looked at them, you would expand more on what people say. Did some of you get not far at all? Sometimes doing these interviews, people get like 3 or 4 questions in and that's it. They run out of time. 15 minutes, they run out. So timing is an issue. When I did my research, I set up to do 3 interviews, an hour and a half each, which is following the style that's on the PowerPoints. And I went over. Way over. The questions we set up 10 questions. I had two or three, I think, sort of set aside. So if the interview went too quick and we had time to draw some more information, we might ask these further questions. I didn't write my questions alone. I wrote them alone, and then they were reviewed by 3 supervisors. Each of them looked at it and said, what about this? What about this? Are you missing this? You need to draw this out. Good interviewing is not a solo process. Good interviewing needs a second set of eyes on it, a second mind to review it and say, for self-critique, which is what you're doing in this course. This whole course is all set up for you to do it and self-critique. Think about it after and say, would I do it differently? So the interview going in ahead of time, you go in and you ask ahead of time, what am I doing here? What's the point of my interview? So that asking what you're trying to make sure you've got your issues in a decent order, your questions. So like I said, there's some people who get 3 or 4 questions answered and they're finished. They run out of time. I had 10 questions. Those 10 questions for me ran me an hour and a half. Every interview I did was at least an hour and a half, someone a little bit over. I tried to keep it at an hour and a half. And there was 3 of them with each research subject. I had 6 research subjects.
Mr. Jobs, you're a bright and influential man.
Back up I talk.
Here it comes.
It's sad and clear that on several counts you've discussed, you don't know what you're talking about. I would like, for example, for you to express in clear terms how, say, Java, in any of its incarnations, addresses the ideas embodied in Open Doc. And when you're finished with that, perhaps you could tell us what you personally have been doing for the last 7 years.
So did you hear that question? Who threw it? Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs is like, I don't know how to describe the guy, but clearly brilliant. He is very, very driven. So he got asked a very pointed question. One is a very technical one. The Java, tell us about Java. I'm interested how this fits in Open Doc, blah, blah, blah. It's technology terms. We probably don't understand it. But then he says, and tell us what you've been doing for the last 7 years. Now it's personal. And here's the question. The Java one's the technical one. He can answer the technical one, no problem. Blah, 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 blah. He'll just ring it off. The personal one is the question becomes, in the interview, will he answer the personal question?
You know, you can please some of the people some of the time, but one of the hardest things when you're trying to affect change is that people like this gentleman are right in some areas. I'm sure that there are some things OpenDoc does, probably even more that I'm not familiar with, that nothing else out there does. And I'm sure that you can make some demos, maybe a small commercial app that demonstrates those things. The hardest thing is, how does that fit in to a cohesive, larger vision that's going to allow you to sell?
So he's talking the technical stuff. Will he ever go into the personal stuff? We don't need to watch it to see. In a big audience like this is a performance piece, which will certainly come up into next week, week 7 and 8. The performance principle starts to kick in. You'll see it, and Goffman will look at it. But it's the idea of hearing a performance. You're not stuck on it quite the same way. The answer is not personal. It's not in close. It's not a safe environment. This is complete exposure. This is not unlike what Williams faced in his interview, in that he's got this, what might come of it. So in the qualitative interview, when we're doing an up-close personal interview, I want that person, if I was asking Steve Jobs, talking to him, I would ask him in a different way. I would, first, what I do is most of my interview would be set up around trying to develop the rapport to make it run. The Williams interview was 4.5 hours of rapport building. And then the hard questions hit. And then the truth came out, and he exposed himself, and he was vulnerable. When you ask somebody about something personal, you're asking them to be vulnerable. You're asking them to expose themselves. Consider that. That's what interviews about. That's what makes interviewing really interesting research. It's an interesting method to engage. So wonderful, and because you get them to tell you their world, ethnographic terms. They tell you what their world is. They explain it. They establish a frame of reference for you. So you might find the interviews good with surveys, could be with observations, participant observations. It might back up what you think you saw. The interviews might set up a tone where you say, wow, I need to go from these interviews. I did a few interviews. I need to go do a lot of surveys to see if I'm correct. Does what I learned out of from these 4 or 5 people apply to the whole volume of people? So it is ethnographic very much. We're getting a feeling from those people. You're getting access, and these all get run through in the slides, so you don't really need me to go over them. But the big issue that you'll hear me harp on is confidentiality. What's the risk of sanction? Who might get hurt? If you ask them interview questions and then you publish what they say or you report on what they say in an interview, you might well put somebody at risk of being harmed financially, their job, or harmed in that you post their material out in the world. There's another one that worked that was really interesting. Richard Nixon. So he's a president in the 60s. He's kind of got a bully tactic, I'd say, to his politics, not unlike the Bush families, I guess. So Nixon is involved in Vietnam. And then there's a thing that comes up about taping. And so in the US, got to understand their politics. You need perspective to this. In the US, you're Republican or you're Democrat. This is like Northern Ireland. You're either loyalist or Republican. Loyal to the crown, because Northern Ireland is England. But we see it here, I think, and most of us see it as Ireland. It's actually Northern Ireland because it's attached to England. It is a part of England, although it's attached physically to Ireland. So the people that live in Northern Ireland, some people believe in the Republic and they want to just be part of the island of which they were. England came and colonized. The first slaves that England took were Irish. So Northern Ireland got taken and colonized and owned by England and has never been given up. So there's a lot of people that are saying, no, we are Irish and we're the Republic and we should be connected. And then there's a lot there who are loyalists who say, no, we are with the Queen and we stay with the Queen. So which is it? And you can't tell the difference. Well, at least I can't tell the difference, the accent from one to another to know who's a loyalist and who's a Republican. Or if you want to put it in different terms, who's Catholic and who's Protestant. The Catholic issue in Northern Ireland attaches to the Republic issue of Southern Ireland. So the US is very much the same. You are Republican or Democrat. Republican means every state is its own individual country, essentially. Each state, they united together to become the United States, like Europe did. The European Union, that's what the Republicans are saying. We want to be individual states that are rallied together in this way, maybe for economic gain, but otherwise we're completely separate, like the European Union, individual states. Whereas Democrats say, no, we're all together. More government, less government is the argument. Families are split over, and it's not families are split at the table arguing about it. I'm a liberal, you're a conservative in Canada. We just talk about it. And we still in a family. In the US, families are split. You are on the other team. You're not my family anymore. This is a deeply entrenched mindset, much like Northern Ireland. So it just hasn't gone to the violence here that it has there. So what you get in it is, in that US thing, there's this interesting interview with Nixon. And there's some discussion about it. I don't know if they've been accused, but essentially it's called Watergate. His party is secretly taping the discussions going on in the other party in their offices. And then they're doing things based on it. They're trying to stay in power. They want to stay in office. They want to make more money. That's kind of how it works. But they're secretly taping the other team. Well, it's not like hockey game where things just went bad. This is about huge differences in attitude about life and who we are as Americans and all of that stuff. He on public television is being interviewed by some guy, David Frost. He's a journalist. He's pretty good. He gets Nixon to admit that he's taping the other party. Watergate blows up. David Frost gets him so comfortable in talking that the guy, call it stupid if you want. It's an absolute, complete faux pas on the part of the president of the United States to admit that he's taping the other party. But he does it on public television. Why? Because he made a mistake? Because he made a mistake because he was so comfortable. It's a research method, interview process. It's a qualitative, that's all it did. That's all I see in a qualitative interview. So sanctions, yeah, he got thrown out of office real fast. So sanctions, when you watch that clip I have of Williams, same thing. Why did Williams give it up? Because he was comfortable. In that moment, he got trapped in that moment of saying, I did. And then he does another 4 hours of telling the police officer everything that he did. So why did he suddenly become the confessional? Why did he confess? You can, and when you watch the interview, what I want you to watch for is how that interviewer, so it happens to be a police officer in interrogation, but I want you to watch how that interviewer makes that environment comfortable, emotionally comfortable for the person to be vulnerable, to say what they want. So in-depth interviews, very much they're about digging through the material, digging in deep, asking lots. Who is the interviewer is an important piece that comes out of the process. I explained what I did in my own research project. I had 6 people to interview. I needed to make sure we figured out 6 was a good number. So I wanted somebody, it's a predominantly male group. I needed a woman to speak to issues around gender at the time. Right now at the time, depending on the work, I might actually speak to somebody. I might be looking for somebody who identifies other than as simply male or female. I might look for someone who will identify as trans, or someone who will even just doesn't want to identify. I might look to break down that gender barrier in a much broader term today than I did 20 odd years ago. The age of the participants mattered. We realized that most are in their mid-20s, but we want some people older. We need some people younger too. We need to see if, is there a variation when you change age, does that impact it? So here's where the interview process, even though it's qualitative and it's very much a curious exploring, I am thinking independent variables or intervening variables, I guess. Here's what let's find out what the work is about. Is it different if you have someone, a different gender issue? Is it different? Would that change the way it's viewed? The age of the participants, would the view of the work change given the age of the participants? Younger people versus older people, do they see it differently? Is it different if there's people of different ethnic backgrounds or cultural backgrounds along the way? Would it change the way they view the work they were doing? Maybe not just their own, but here's when you broaden it out. How about the ethnicity of the people that they're spending their time working with? Are they working with people from their own culture, different cultures? What about that intercultural conversations, if you like? How did they flow? So I need to speak to that, and I wanted to speak to it across time to get a sense of over the last 10 or 20 years, is it similar? So these things were what we identified. We identified issues that mattered, figured out how many people would be appropriate to interview because of time. 6 was the right number. 6 people took me 2 years to take it, do it, analyze it, 2 years. So this here, working through these potential intervening variables, I cover them off by who I speak to. And then you get into the different styles, what goes into the interview. Ultimately, what you get down to here is, and you watch the video, it's got all the clicks. But when you watch it, each interview is a good 90 minutes. 10 questions took me 90 minutes. I ran out of time. You should leave and come back. You should take breaks. This all gets discussed a little better, on that online video. There's no point me doing it here because then you're gonna have to watch it and say, ah, this is the same stuff you already said. So it makes more sense to have you look at it on your own. Hang on. To just watch the video. So for this week, you've seen surveys. How do I do this? Stop share. Oh, stop share. You've seen your survey, done the surveys, looked at those. You've written a set of questions, which weren't for surveys, but if they were, pardon me, if they were for surveys, how would you change them? And if you were to redo that interview, would you do it differently now? That's what I want you to think about when you watch my posted videos for the class, when you watch the Williams stuff. I want you to look at that, rethink what you did. Would you do it differently? Something tells me you might. Don't, and there's no right or wrong in it. I don't want you to think about, oh, it's right, it's wrong. This is the method or not. I want you to just think about how you feel about it. The way you get good in interviewing ultimately is just doing it. It's nice. Technology is a helpful tool. It's not a lifestyle. It's become a lifestyle for you. You guys don't even think about how much you use it. I'm suggesting take a pencil and paper. Pencil's nice, unless you're left-handed and you spill something on it, then your pencil's gone too. Pen, right? They're all the same questions. What tools do I take with me to an interview? So the nice part about the electronic one is you just set it down and let it run and you capture everything. If you do the written one, it works nicely, but it's slower. I like the two together. So what I do, if this is a piece of paper here, I take my piece of paper, I show up and I draw an arrow. I essentially take my page and I split it in half. I ask my question and answer on this side. This is where everything is in. This is an open space. You might write your question out, ask it here, and then get your answer. But this would have a lot of open space. You would have writing here. And then there'd be a big open space. Over here, you'd have writing. And it goes on and on because it's what they answer. It's going to get long. And then you're going to have a big open space. And then you're going to have, again, your question down here. The value of doing this, or for some people, they do question and answer together on this side, and they leave this open. The value of this. So this works for two things. There's another one, I think it's called, I just heard about it last week, Nolan. I think it's a Nolan style. When you write your notes in a class, you could do the same thing. You split your page in three. Now, what I heard with it is in the middle section of your page, you write all of your data. You write all of the material you think is important that you're writing, because most of you do that in class. When I've seen you in class, you're writing everything down as much as you can. You don't need to do that the same anymore. The stuff's posted. But then you come back after and you review down this side, you review your notes right after class. You would review these notes, and in here you'd put the keywords that you think matter. And then you find a way to link them together. So that might be, I think, the third column. It's worth looking at. I haven't looked at it myself yet, but it's worth a thought about looking at, because then what you do is you've got your keywords out of all of this data. You pull out the keywords that are important, and then you show the right here's maybe where you write up how the keywords link together. So what did I say today about interviewing that was worth hearing? This has got all the data. This is what's worth hearing, and this is how you link it. So for interviewing, for taking your notes on this, you might have everything written here. For here, I would say inter-subjectivity, survey different than survey questions, answer options, interview, qualitative. So I'd have Q, interview, open-ended. And then over here, I would draw a little link and say, in the one, the work is up front, the one, the work is out back. The other thing I suggest for maybe note taking is circles and squares. And I do this in an interview. If someone is talking to me and I find something important, I will, or in a class, I put a circle around it. Oh, that's interesting. If it's really interesting and I think there's a point I need to take from it, then I put a triangle around it. And I draw arrows from the circles to the triangles and then eventually to a square or rectangle, which is where I then ask for more detail. That is how I do it in my head. I do circle, triangle, square. So, and I draw arrows between them to link key points out of a lecture, which is kind of what I've suggested you do with your textbook. So in an interview, you would do the same thing. In an interview, you would write all the data, but leave this blank. If they say something important here, you write a little note here. You can come back and put a little note here of something you want to get to. When you're finished an interview, an hour and a half later, 30, 40 pages of writing, you can come back and skim through this really quick and pull out the key point that you wanted to refresh, you wanted to get more detail on. You can pull it out of here because you've written it over here. It's easy to find. And it keeps, what is important to me is the flow of the interview. The flow is a key word. Conversation. Have you talked to somebody when you're talking to them, their eyes are rolling off somewhere else, they're not interested. They're tired, they're falling asleep. You know that you're sort of they're not really with you. Interviewing is exactly the same thing. If you lose your interview subject, you've lost them. How do you get them back? I say don't. I say either take a break and try again, and if it doesn't come back, end it. Come back another day. They're worn out. They've had enough. It's not working. And there's a difference between interview and interrogation. In an interview, we say, okay, they've had enough. Thank you. Oh, can we talk tomorrow maybe or next week? We keep that alive. In the interrogation, they're not letting them go. That's the only difference. An interrogation, a good interrogation, feels like an interview. Although it's actually, they're not going to let them walk out the door because they're going to push to try and get the answer. However, if it goes really well, the vulnerability comes in, that interrogation turns into an interview, and you got what we saw in Williams. And that's happened time and time again with serial offenders who are murderers, sexual offenders. It's happened over and over because they felt safe to talk. So this style of using a piece of paper, I think, is really valuable. And you use that with the recorded tool, because if your recording goes, you still have the notes. If the notes don't work out, hopefully you still have the recording. Something should work. So there's interviewing.